The Georgia sun was just beginning to dip behind the pines as Justice Naomi Sinclair, 75 years old and barely 4 months into her appointment to the United States Supreme Court, turned her Lincoln sedan onto Broadleaf Road, heading home from her weekly visit to her husband's grave. Her movements were slow but measured, her recovery from recent knee surgery still ongoing. The car was a modest silver model, clean but aged. Much like Naomi herself, unassuming in appearance, but unshakable in purpose. She'd spent decades in courtrooms fighting for justice. Others had been denied. But nothing in her long, distinguished life would prepare her for what happened that evening at approximately 7:42. A sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror sliced through the golden dusk. Naomi's breath caught, but her hands didn't tremble. She had been a black woman in America long enough to know how to conduct herself in a traffic stop. She slowed to a complete halt, pulled over on the shoulder, turned off her engine, and placed both hands squarely on the wheel, palms open. Fingers spread. This wasn't fear. It was preparation. Behind her, the squad car idled loudly. Naomi glanced once at her speedometer. She had been driving exactly 35 miles an hour, the posted limit. She hadn't touched her phone, hadn't run a light, and had come to a full stop at the sign back on Maple and 5th. She replayed the last 2 blocks in her mind, meticulous as always. Nothing warranted a stop. The driver's door of the cruiser slammed. Officer Garrett Nash, white, 34 years old, and built like a man who spent more time at the gym than at a library, approached with a swagger that made Naomi's stomach turn. She had seen this demeanor before from opposing counsel, from belligerent bailiffs, from power-drunk sheriffs in courtrooms across the South. She knew it too well. His mirrored sunglasses were still on despite the fading light, and his right hand hovered just inches from his holstered weapon. He rapped twice on her window. She lowered it halfway. "License and registration." He barked. Naomi nodded. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" "You ran that stop sign back there on 5th, he snapped. "Don't play dumb. I need your documents now." Naomi kept her voice even, the same tone she used on the bench. "I believe I came to a complete stop, sir, but I'll get you what you need." She reached slowly into her purse on the passenger seat, fingers deliberately visible. "I am also recovering from a knee replacement and can't exit the car easily, just to let you know." Officer Nash's lip curled. "You people always got some excuse. Let's go. Step out of the car." Naomi blinked. "Officer, I'd be happy to comply, but stepping out will take me a moment. As I mentioned, I've had surgery recently. If you'd prefer, I can hand you my ID through the window." But Garrett Nash had already reached for her door handle. With a violent jerk, he flung the door open. "I set out." "Now?" The movement startled Naomi, and her breath hitched. "Officer," she began, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Justice Naomi Sinclair of the Yeah." "Sure?" He cut her off with a sneer. "And I'm the damn Secretary of Defense." "Save the act." With a hand roughly planted on her shoulder, he began to haul her from the seat. "Wait, please, my knee," Naomi gasped. He didn't listen. In one swift motion, he pulled her upright, then shoved her back against the hood of her car. Pain surged through her joints, her surgically repaired leg giving out beneath her. She cried out, a short, sharp sound, but didn't resist. She couldn't. Nash didn't care. "I smell marijuana," he announced loudly. "There's no such thing in my vehicle," she said through gritted teeth. "That's probable cause. I'm searching it." "You do not have my consent to search," Naomi said firmly. "And you are in violation of—" That's when the baton came down. A blunt, snapping pain exploded across her upper back. just below the neck. She stumbled forward, caught herself on the hood. "You're resisting arrest!" Nash shouted for the benefit of any passer-by. But the road was mostly empty, just the swish of cars in the distance and the growing darkness settling over the street. Naomi tried to speak again, but another blow struck her arm. She collapsed halfway onto the hood, her temple striking the hot metal. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. In seconds, her hands were yanked behind her back. Cold metal clamped onto her wrists. The handcuffs bit into her skin. Her voice, when she could speak again, was hoarse. "You're making a terrible mistake." "Shut up," he hissed. "You're lucky I don't tase you." 2. From across the street. A porch light flickered on. Naomi saw a figure step out, holding up a phone. Recording. Nash didn't seem to notice. He grabbed Naomi by the arm and shoved her toward the back seat of his cruiser. Her head struck the roof frame as he forced her in. Justice Naomi Sinclair, who had once argued landmark cases before the highest courts in the land, who had marched in Selma as a teenager and taught constitutional law at Yale before ascending to the bench, sat bruised and bleeding in the back seat of a police car. Her head throbbed, her knee pulsed. Her heart pounded not with fear, but with outrage. All her years on the bench, all her years defending the Constitution, none of it had protected her from the routine brutality millions faced every day. She looked out through the metal grate separating her from the front seat. Nash sat there, smug and silent, radioing in his report. One female, resisting, possibly mentally unstable, unknown identity, wheel transport for booking. She closed her eyes. The night wasn't done, not by a long shot. But Naomi Sinclair, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, had just experienced firsthand the very injustice she had spent a lifetime condemning, and this time, she would not only write the opinion, she would live it, and the nation would watch what happened next. The Fairview County Detention Center sat like a concrete bunker on the outskirts of town. A squat gray structure ringed with barbed wire and floodlights that burned through the darkness like interrogation lamps aimed at the soul. Inside, the air was sharp with the bite of disinfectant and stale sweat, humming with the low thrum of buzzing fluorescence. When Justice Naomi Sinclair, still bleeding from her temple, her hands bruised from the steel cuffs, was shoved through the sally port and into the booking area, she became just another body to process. 9:17 p.m., according to the digital clock on the wall. Though time, for Naomi, had already begun to blur. She walked under her own power, barely, her left knee, post-surgical and unsteady, buckled slightly with every step. The pain was sharp and urgent, but she refused to let it show. Blood had dried across the side of her face, crusted in her silver curls. The booking officer, a heavy-set man in a khaki shirt with sweat stains under his arms and sarcasm in his eyes, didn't so much as flinch when he saw her condition. "What did this one do?" he asked lazily, not looking up from his screen. "Resisting, possibly under the influence. Claims to be somebody important," Officer Garrett Nash replied, removing his sunglasses at last. "Says she's a Supreme Court justice." The clerk raised his head, finally giving Naomi a glance. He snorted. "Well, ain't that something? Welcome to Fairview, Your Honor." He mimed a little bow and turned back to his computer. Naomi didn't respond. Not yet. Her lips were pressed tight, a single trickle of blood still edging down her jawline. The indignity had just begun. They fingerprinted her, smearing her inked hands against the glass like she was cattle at auction. They took her mugshot twice, Because the first time. Naomi didn't lift her head fast enough for the camera. The second photo showed her eyes wide and haunted, one pupil slightly dilated from the blow to her skull. The flash of the camera reflected in the dried blood, like a cruel joke. Then came the questioning. Name, the clerk asked. Naomi Sinclair. Occupation. I am an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Silence. The clerk's eyebrows lifted. He turned to Nash. She's serious. She's crazy, Nash replied with a smirk. Naomi held his gaze. You can verify my identity with a single phone call. Yeah. That's what all the fakes say. He tossed her wallet onto the desk. Her federal judicial ID card, gold-sealed and embossed, glinted under the fluorescent lights. The clerk picked it up, studied it, then laughed. Wow, that's a good one. Real high-end counterfeit. Bet that cost you a fortune. It's real, Naomi said quietly. Well, it doesn't matter now. You're going in. When she asked for medical attention for the bleeding, for her pounding head, for her unsteady leg, the clerk waved her off. We'll get to you when the nurse gets through the real criminals. I am 75 years old, Naomi said. I have hypertension, a recently replaced knee, and a head wound, and I've got a sinus infection, he replied. We all got problems. They took her purse and rummaged through it. Her prescription medication, 2 bottles, one for blood pressure. The other for post-op inflammation was pulled out and dropped into a plastic evidence bag. I need those, Naomi said. Yeah? Well, the doc'll decide that. Could be drugs in there. Gotta wait. Her voice, firm but weary, carried the weight of decades in the law. You are denying me medically necessary treatment. Sounds like a lawsuit. The officer chuckled. You a lawyer too. Your Honor, I helped argue Brown v. Board cases before your mother was born, Naomi replied. That silenced him, but only for a moment. Time for your new look, another officer called, holding up an orange jumpsuit. Hope orange is your color. Naomi drew herself up, despite the ache in her joints. I have not been convicted of a crime. You cannot force me into prison attire. You're in our house now, he said. This ain't D.C., lady. They escorted her to a narrow room with peeling paint and a rusty bench. A female guard named Officer Jenkins gave her 5 minutes to change. Naomi complied, slowly, wincing with every movement. The jumpsuit hung loose on her slender frame, the cotton stiff and scratchy. When she emerged, the officers barely concealed their laughter. That robe doesn't suit you. Justice, someone muttered behind a clipboard. They placed her in a holding cell with 5 other women, 2 black, 2 Latina, and 1 white. The floor was sticky. The bench was metal and cold. There was no clock, no blanket, and no silence, just the endless hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional distant shout from another cell block. Naomi sat straight-backed, breathing through her pain, determined not to let them see her break. She wasn't just enduring for herself. She was bearing witness. Every slight, every insult, every denial of dignity would be remembered, documented, and exposed. But even steel has its limits. Her vision blurred. The pressure in her skull pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs had rubbed her raw. She asked for a blanket. None came. She asked for water. None arrived. Hours passed. And then finally, a shift in the air. A figure stood at the bars, hesitant, eyes darting left and right. A young Latina woman in a crisp uniform, barely out of the academy by the look of her, with a name tag that read D. Ruiz. Ma'am, she whispered. Are you okay? Naomi looked up. The young officer's voice was soft, but her face was serious. I'm fine, Naomi said. For now. Officer Ruiz slipped a small paper cup through the bars. 2 aspirin floated in it like lifeboats. "This is all I can give you," she said. "I'm sorry." Naomi accepted the water with quiet gratitude. "You know who I am." "Yes, ma'am. My uncle clerks at the federal courthouse in Atlanta. I recognized you from the photos in his office." Naomi's breath caught for a moment. "Then you know this is wrong." "I do," Ruiz said. "And I called him. He's already made some calls. Help is coming." Naomi's eyes stung, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded. "Thank you." Before she could say more, Ruiz disappeared down the corridor, her footsteps soft and quick, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Naomi allowed herself to close her eyes. Not to sleep would not come in this place, but to gather her strength. She would need it, because whatever waited outside that cell, whatever chaos or cover-up or scandal was about to break. She knew one thing with crystalline clarity. They had arrested the wrong woman, and they were about to find out just how wrong they'd been, at exactly 4:26 in the morning. The heavy iron door of Naomi Sinclair's cell buzzed and groaned open. She had been awake for hours, though sleep had been elusive long before that. Her head still throbbed from the baton strike, her body aching from the cold metal bench and the absence of medication, but her mind was sharp, razor sharp. She watched as a pair of officers approached, not with the disdain of the night before, but with something resembling apprehension. One of them, younger than the rest, avoided her eyes as he unlatched the door. "Justice Sinclair," he muttered. "You're being released. Not ma'am, not your honor, just a name and a directive." Naomi stood, slowly, with dignity. Despite the stiffness in her joints and the sharp pang from her left knee, she followed them down the corridor, past cells that now seemed to hold more witnesses than prisoners. Her orange jumpsuit hung awkwardly on her, but she held her head high. By the time they reached the administrative desk, the air had shifted. Tension rippled through the room like static before a storm. An older man with a salt and pepper crew cut, broad-shouldered and red-faced, waited by the booking counter. Chief Randall Croft, the man at the top of the Fairview County Police Department, was buttoning his collar as he turned toward her with what must have been his version of regret. He looked like a man who had been summoned in the dead of night and told his empire had cracked. "Justice Sinclair," he began, his voice tight with forced deference, "I want to offer my deepest apologies for the unfortunate series of events that occurred last night." Naomi said nothing. She let the silence stretch, her gaze fixed and unblinking. Croft cleared his throat. "There was a significant oversight. Officer Nash failed to verify your identity, and he struck me with a baton, denied me medical care, confiscated my medication, mocked my title, told others I was delusional. Is that the part you're calling an oversight?" Naomi asked, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. Croft hesitated, then gestured weakly to the paperwork. "We're releasing you immediately and arranging a car to take you home. Your vehicle is being recovered. Of course, your record will show no charges." Naomi lifted her hand. "Stop. I want all booking documentation preserved. Intake reports, officer logs, medical denials, audio recordings, and every second of security footage from this facility, including my time in the holding cell." Croft blinked. "Of course, but you understand. Some of the, if anything goes missing." She interrupted. "I'll assume it was destroyed intentionally." Another silence. Croft's jaw twitched. "Justice Sinclair, I understand your frustration. You do not," Naomi snapped. "But you will, because I am not going to let this be handled quietly." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "May I suggest? With respect, that discretion would benefit all parties involved. The department is prepared to issue a formal apology. And you want me to go home," Naomi said, her voice cold and unrelenting. "Clean myself up and pretend this didn't happen. But you didn't pull over a librarian or a teacher last night. You pulled over a Supreme Court justice, and I intend to use every ounce of my authority to make sure this department answers for what it's done, not just to me, but to every person who couldn't fight back." Croft's expression faltered for a split second, the mask slipping. Then he stiffened, nodded curtly, and gestured to the officer nearby. "Return her belongings, and make sure someone drives her home." By 5:06, Naomi was back in her own clothes. The judicial ID returned to her with a mumbled apologies from an officer who couldn't quite meet her eyes. A plain black SUV waited outside. The early morning air was cool, almost tender against her battered skin. As she climbed inside, she saw a camera flash in the distance, just one, but enough to signal the media had caught wind. And by sunrise, the firestorm had begun. At 8:15, the story hit national news: Supreme Court justice detained in Georgia jail after traffic stop. By 9:42, the footage captured by the bystander across the street the night before had gone viral. Naomi, clearly bleeding, clearly unarmed, being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. Headlines flooded the internet. Networks scrambled for confirmation. Cable anchors speculated breathlessly. Commentators called it shocking, unthinkable, disgraceful. But by 11:32, the tide began to turn. An anonymous department source told a local paper that Justice Sinclair had been combative. Another stated she had a history of erratic behavior. The Fairview Times published an article highlighting Naomi's unconventional rulings, calling her a judicial activist with a soft-on-crime legacy. A right-wing blog ran a headline that read, "Radical Judge Fabricates Police Abuse Claim Demands Special Treatment." Within the hour, screenshots from 30-year-old traffic tickets were circulating, as if a parking violation in 1991 justified a baton to the head. Then came the leaks. Her medical history, her real estate records, tax returns from 2015. Anonymous op-eds in conservative outlets questioned her mental fitness. A talking head on a major news network asked whether advanced age and ideological bias had clouded her perception. Hashtags like #senile Sinclair and Justice or Drama started to trend ugly, viral, deliberate. Naomi sat in her living room, ice pressed to her temple, her leg elevated, watching it all unfold on the screen. Beside her, Isaac Monroe, her former clerk turned closest confidant, scrolled through a dozen open tabs on his laptop. "They're orchestrating this," he said, his voice flat with fury. "They're not just spinning the story, they're trying to erase it entirely. Or worse, flip it." Naomi nodded slowly. "This is the machine. I knew it would come." He looked over at her. "They're afraid of you." "They should be," she said. By 1 p.m., cable news showed Chief Croft giving a carefully worded press conference. "We regret the events that took place and are cooperating fully with all relevant oversight bodies," he said. "We are committed to transparency." But he made no mention of Officer Nash's name, no apology, no responsibility. The smear campaign intensified. Someone released doctored audio clips, misrepresenting Naomi's court statements as anti-police rhetoric. A segment on Evening News tried to imply her background as a civil rights litigator made her inherently biased against law enforcement. They questioned her temperament, her objectivity, her legacy. But what they couldn't erase Was the truth a 75-year-old Supreme Court justice had been assaulted, arrested, mocked, and denied care for the crime of driving while black? Naomi turned off the television that night at 9:48, silence washing over her like a balm. Isaac sat across from her, still scrolling, eyes wide with fury. "They're weaponizing your dignity," he said. "They're trying to drown the truth in noise." Naomi, wrapped in a quilt stitched by her mother decades ago, leaned back into her chair. Her body ached, but her voice was steady. "Then we raise our voices above the noise," she said. "We speak louder. We show them what justice looks like when it refuses to be quiet." Because Naomi Sinclair had not spent her life fighting uphill battles to be silenced in her twilight. They could smear, distort, lie. But what had happened was real, and the whole world had seen it. She would not just survive this. She would dismantle the machine that tried to destroy her. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Naomi Sinclair, wrapped in a soft navy shawl and gripping a mug of coffee gone cold, stared at the growing constellation of documents taped across her living room wall. It was 6:21 a.m., the room still wrapped in the hush of dawn. But the air felt electric, as though something ancient and long buried had started to stir. She wasn't just preparing for a legal case. She was preparing for a siege, one that would strike at the very architecture of corruption built into the foundation of Fairview County. And she wasn't going in alone. Across from her, seated cross-legged on the floor in jeans and a wrinkled Oxford shirt, was Isaac Monroe, former clerk, now investigator, analyst, and co-strategist in what had quickly transformed from a case of individual brutality into an unmasking of institutional rot. His laptop glowed with spreadsheets, scanned court filings, and whistleblower emails as he spoke. "I've run the numbers 3 times. There's no ambiguity here. The quota system is real," he said, swiveling the screen toward her. "Every officer in the department is required to meet minimums 10 citations per week. 15 if you want bonus shifts or overtime. There's even a sliding scale if you bring in more. You're more likely to be promoted." Naomi leaned in, her eyes scanning the digitized departmental memos, plain fonts. Boilerplate formatting, language clinical and dry. But the implications were radioactive. And these quotas, they're not being enforced countywide. Isaac shook his head. "No, only in certain designated enforcement zones, which, funny enough, map perfectly onto the predominantly black neighborhoods Jefferson Heights, East Mill, portions of Riverside. Meanwhile, districts like Willow Grove and Bayberry have no enforcement quotas. Those are mostly white." Naomi inhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. It's not just racial profiling. It's policy-backed economic persecution. "And here's the kicker," Isaac said, opening another file. "Revenue from traffic fines accounts for over 41% of Fairview County's discretionary operating budget. They're literally funding the government on the backs of its black residents." Naomi felt the words settle in her chest like bricks. State-sanctioned theft in the language of law and order. But the deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. 3 days later, over takeout cartons and courtroom transcripts, Naomi and Isaac traced a series of seemingly mundane financial transfers from Fairview County to a private corrections corporation called Sentinel Corrections, a name Naomi hadn't heard in years but recognized instantly. "Wait," she said, sitting bolt upright. "Sentinel. The same Sentinel Corrections that ran that facility in Fulton County." Isaac nodded grimly. "The same. They were nearly sued into oblivion in 2018 for a string of wrongful deaths. But here in Fairview, They've rebranded, took over the county detention center under a new contract signed just last year. Naomi scanned the agreement, her stomach tightening with every clause. Guaranteed occupancy, she whispered, 85%, meaning if the jail isn't at least 85% full. The county pays Sentinel penalties out of taxpayer money. She stared at the paper, her fingers trembling with fury. So they have a financial incentive to fill that jail every single day. Isaac nodded. And guess who signed off on the contract, Redford? She said flatly. The mayor. And guess who received $62,000 in campaign contributions from Sentinel's corporate PAC? Over the last 5 years, Naomi didn't need the answer. It had been written in stone since the moment her wrists had been cuffed and her ID laughed at. This isn't just corruption, she murmured. It's a pipeline. Quotas feed citations. Citations feed arrests. Arrests feed occupancy. And occupancy feeds profit. It's a business model dressed in a badge. They built a diagram across her dining room wall, index cards. Red string. Highlighters bleeding into old paint. In the center sat Officer Garrett Nash, who had wielded his baton with impunity. But Nash was only a node. Above him, Naomi scrawled Chief Randall Croft, enforcer of the quota system. Beside him, Mayor Clayton Redford, recipient of Sentinel's money and signer of its contracts. And looming just to the right. Naomi circled the final link in the chain, Judge Ellis Drummond. This part's hard to track, Isaac said late one night, his voice raw from hours of reading court records. But I found it. He pulled up a family announcement in a society newsletter from 1994. Redford Drummond Union announced. It read, beside a black and white photo of a beaming young couple, Mayor Redford's sister married Ellis Drummond nearly 30 years ago. They've kept their names separate. But it's there. He's been shielding this machine from the bench. And the cases, Naomi asked, already fearing the answer. Drummond presided over 82% of all police misconduct hearings in the last decade, Isaac said, and he dismissed 91% of them without full evidentiary review. Most didn't even make it past the preliminary stage. Naomi rubbed her temple, where the scar from Nash's baton was still healing beneath her skin. So if someone files a complaint against the cops, it goes to Drummond. He tosses it. The records stay clean. The cycle continues. And nobody says a word, Isaac added. Because the system was built that way. Naomi stood slowly, pacing, her movements slow and deliberate. This is organized. It's coordinated. It's protected by money, office, and law. They didn't just assault me, they revealed themselves. She turned to Isaac. We're not filing a complaint. We're filing a civil RICO case. Isaac blinked. Racketeering, exactly. Naomi said, because that's what this is. An enterprise built on extortion, fraud, and racial exploitation. Officer Nash is the visible face, but the real crime lives in the collusion between government, courts, and private industry. They began cataloging every piece of evidence like building a prosecution from the ground up. Naomi's mugshot, her medical denial records, the booking logs, the surveillance tapes, what little survived. Isaac compiled witness statements from former detainees, some of whom had already reached out after seeing the news coverage. Each had similar stories, traffic stops without cause, arrests for resisting when they asked why they were stopped, cells full of poor, black, and brown bodies too scared or too broke to fight back. Naomi reached out to an old colleague at the Southern Center for Constitutional Justice, and, within 24 hours, they had a full legal team volunteering pro bono. A former federal prosecutor signed on to assist with strategy. A forensic data expert began archiving every document and metadata string, and when word of the case leaked to the press, something began to shift in the public air. "They thought they could shut me down with shame," Naomi said in a televised interview with PBS NewsHour, "but they forgot that I don't carry shame, I carry law. And it will be the law that dismantles them." The next morning, her mailbox overflowed with letters, some hateful, but many filled with thanks, support, prayers, and small donations scribbled on personal checks. One note, from a 92-year-old woman in Atlanta, simply read, "What they did to you. They've done to us for decades, but you're making sure it stops." Naomi taped that letter above her desk. By the end of that week, they were ready. The RICO complaint was 83 pages long, meticulous, blistering, and unflinching. It named Officer Nash, Chief Croft, Mayor Redford, Judge Drummond, and Sentinel Corrections as co-conspirators in a racketeering enterprise that targeted citizens of color through fraudulent enforcement for financial and political gain. As Naomi signed the final page, her hands steady, Isaac looked up at her and said, "Once this is filed, there's no going back." Naomi met his eyes, her voice quiet but resolute. There never was. They would submit it at 9 a.m., sharp at the federal courthouse in Atlanta. And once it was filed, the real war would begin. It began the way storms do quietly, with a shift in the air so slight that only those who've weathered violence know what it means. Naomi Sinclair was sipping chamomile tea at 7:28 p.m., the windows drawn against the early evening wind, when her phone rang and shattered the stillness. On the other end was an ER nurse from Grady Memorial, her voice clipped but careful. "Ms. Sinclair, your colleague, Mr. Isaac Monroe, he's here. He was attacked in his apartment's parking garage. Multiple contusions, possible broken ribs, concussion. He's stable now, but shaken. You may want to come." Naomi didn't remember putting down the mug or grabbing her coat. Only the silent, seething blur of 23 minutes in traffic. Her hands clenched white against the wheel. When she reached the hospital and saw Isaac, his face swollen and marbled with bruises, his arm in a sling and gauze taped across his temple, something inside her turned cold. Ice cold. Not the fear she had felt in the back of Officer Nash's cruiser. Not even the rage when Chief Croft asked her to remain quiet, but something deeper. A stillness forged in resolve. "They jumped me from behind," Isaac rasped, trying to smile, but failing. "Two of them. Said to tell you this isn't your fight, and to stop digging." Naomi swallowed hard, kneeling beside him. "They're wrong," she said. "It's exactly my fight. And yours. And every person they've silenced." Isaac's hand found hers. "Jamari was supposed to meet me tonight. He never showed." Naomi's chest tightened. Jamari Bell, a former Fairview County Police Department data analyst who had broken ranks 2 weeks earlier, passing Isaac the internal memos on quotas, arrest records, and targeting zones. His testimony was supposed to be the linchpin. A young black man with a brilliant mind and an impeccable record. Without him, parts of the case would stall. "I'll find him," she whispered, but the storm had only just begun. By 2:04 the next morning, Naomi was jolted awake by the shrill wail of her home security alarm. Her front yard was bathed in blue and red, the whine of sirens echoing as officers surveyed the scene. Across her garage door, in letters 6 feet tall, someone had scrawled, "Lying Knock Judge," in dripping red paint. Her rose bushes, Thomas's favorite, had been slashed to the roots. The windows were intact, but on her doorstep lay a shattered gavel wrapped in a black ribbon. Officer Ruiz, the rookie who had shown her quiet mercy in custody weeks earlier, arrived shortly after and moved with a careful respect most of her colleagues lacked. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I'm going to be honest. This doesn't look random." Naomi looked at the gavel in Ruiz's gloved hands. "It isn't." Surveillance footage was grainy. 3 figures, hooded, with military precision. They came and went in under 6 minutes, leaving behind their message and no fingerprints. The police report labeled it vandalism with suspected racial animus. But Naomi didn't need their euphemisms. It was a warning, a promise. At 10:36 a.m., a package arrived at her sister Clarice's home in Savannah, a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a printout of Naomi's mugshot, defaced with crude pen markings. Scrawled across the top, "Tell your sister to shut up, or she'll end up in a cell forever." Folded inside was a clipping from a 1963 Birmingham paper, black protesters pinned against a wall, fire hoses roaring. No signature, no fingerprints. But the message was clear. Clarice called Naomi in tears. "They know where I live. Nay, they know my address." Naomi's voice was calm, even as her fingers trembled. "I'll handle it. I promise," but she couldn't promise safety. Not anymore. 2 days later, Naomi tried to reach Jamari Bell again. Voicemail. No response to texts. Isaac, still bruised but cleared to work in short stints, drove to Jamari's apartment on the city's south side. The door was ajar. Inside, lights still on. Dinner uneaten. His laptop was gone. His phone left charging beside the couch. A tea kettle whistled on the stove, boiling itself empty. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Just absence. Isaac called it in immediately. He wouldn't run. He told Naomi. "Not now. Not when we're this close." Naomi agreed. Jamari had been confident, even defiant. "I know what I saw," he'd said during their first meeting. "I logged the arrest stats, the quotas, the patterns. They've been doing this for years, thinking no one would ever connect the dots." Now he was gone. Naomi met with FBI agents assigned to the federal investigation, handing over everything they had. The threats, the attack on Isaac, the vandalism, the veiled warning to her sister, the disappearance. The evidence was overwhelming, but the message from the agents was chillingly bureaucratic. "We're taking this seriously," one of them said, his expression unreadable. "But unless Bell reappears, or we find direct evidence of foul play, he's considered a voluntary missing adult." Voluntary, as if fear and silence were choices in a war like this. The walls felt like they were closing in. The phone rang less now. Some allies went quiet. Naomi's mailbox began filling with letters again, but the tone had changed. Some warned her not to bring division to the town. Some called her a liar. A few, handwritten in looping script, threatened death. She did not stop. At 5:42 one evening, as the sun bled red behind the skyline, Naomi stood in front of the now scrubbed garage door, the faint trace of spray paint still visible under certain light. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began filming a short video. Isaac held the camera. "I want you to know what fear looks like," she said, her voice measured but searing. "Fear wears uniforms in Fairview County. It files reports. It holds gavels. It calls itself justice. But fear is loudest when it's exposed. That's why they hit Isaac. That's why they came to my home. Why they sent threats to my sister. Why Jamari Bell is gone." She paused. The air around her seemed to thrum. I will not be silenced. And neither will the people this system has hurt for decades. This isn't just about me. This is about a structure built to punish the powerless. I was lucky enough to survive it. But I didn't survive to stay quiet. They posted the video at 6:15 p.m. It was shared over 200,000 times within the first 6 hours. Naomi sat alone that night in the quiet of her study. The shadows long, the silence heavier than any robe she'd worn on the bench. Outside, a patrol car cruised by, its lights dimmed, its engine whispering threats. She looked up at the wall, where Jamari's name was still pinned beneath a printout of Sentinel Corrections' occupancy guarantee. They were coming for her, but they hadn't broken her. Not yet. Not ever. It came not with a roar, but a ripple, a whisper turning into a current, and then into a wave strong enough to break through steel and silence. The tide began to turn at 8:14 a.m. on a Thursday morning when Officer Daniela Ruiz, her hands visibly shaking, stepped up to a podium outside the Fairview County Courthouse and looked straight into the wall of reporters waiting for her to speak. She wore her uniform, but her badge was pinned slightly askew, as if even the metal itself was struggling to know which side of the line it belonged on. I became a police officer to protect my community, she said, voice steadying as she read from a folded sheet. But what I witnessed behind closed doors broke that promise. The people of Fairview deserve to know the truth. So today, I'm releasing a recording taken during a departmental meeting held on March 16th at 4:06 p.m. in the second-floor briefing room of the Fairview County Police Department. She handed a flash drive to the Attorney General's representative standing nearby. I make no excuses, Ruiz said. I just couldn't stay silent anymore. That recording, less than 12 minutes long, hit the internet by 10:32 a.m. By noon, it had detonated across every platform like a digital earthquake. In the tinny static of a phone hidden in Officer Ruiz's pocket, you could hear Chief Randall Croft instructing his officers with the coldness of a man who had stopped pretending he served the law a long time ago. If you get someone like that Sinclair woman again, Croft says, his voice unmistakable, don't waste time debating. Say they resisted. Say they reached. Say you feared for your safety. Make sure the cams are off before anything physical starts. If they complain, bury the reports. We're not getting blown up by another civil rights moment just because an old lady forgets her place. The words hung in the air like smoke from a burning house. That afternoon, while the county scrambled to issue a non-denial denial, and Croft took administrative leave, a different fire was building. A tech journalist named Tyrell Ty Baines, a digital forensics specialist with the Atlanta Examiner, dropped an investigative bombshell that would shift the nation's focus entirely. After weeks of combing through mirrored backups from the department's cloud system and consulting with a whistleblower in Sentinel Corrections' IT division, Ty announced that he had successfully recovered portions of Officer Nash's deleted body cam footage. The footage was damning. It showed Naomi's calm, lawful demeanor during the stop. Her hands remained on the steering wheel. Her voice never rose. The moment she reached for her purse slowly. After informing Nash, he yelled "weapon" and yanked open her door. Then, as Naomi struggled to unbuckle her seatbelt, his baton came down with a sickening crack across her temple. Blood. Confusion. Naomi's voice barely audible. I am Justice Naomi Sinclair of the Supreme Court. And Nash's response, captured with grim clarity. Yeah, and I'm Santa Claus. Shut the hell up, Grandma. The footage spread like wildfire. By 5:28 p.m., it was on every major cable news network. Social media lit up with fury and disbelief. Hashtags like #Justice for Sinclair, Croft cover-up, and FCPD exposed trended worldwide. By nightfall, the Georgia Attorney General, Myra Kent, stood before a bank of microphones with the governor beside her and announced the launch of a full criminal investigation into the Fairview County Police Department and the mayor's office. We have reviewed Officer Ruiz's recording. We have seen the footage recovered by Mr. Baines, and we are launching an immediate criminal probe into what appears to be a coordinated effort to falsify evidence, suppress complaints, intimidate witnesses, and violate the constitutional rights of Fairview citizens, particularly citizens of color, Kent declared. But the final, crushing blow came the next morning, Friday at 6:02 a.m., just as the streets of Fairview began to stir. In unmarked black SUVs and armored vans, the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived. Agents in windbreakers with bold yellow letters fanned out across the city, executing warrants at the Fairview County Police Department, City Hall, and the mayor's residence simultaneously. The raids were fast and overwhelming. They seized files, hard drives, servers, encrypted communications, and boxes of documents labeled innocuously as miscellaneous reports. What they uncovered was more damning than anyone had imagined. Inside the department's secure network, investigators discovered a hidden server containing years' worth of emails and texts between Chief Croft, Mayor Redford, Judge Drummond, and senior officers. The messages were chillingly direct discussions of arrest quotas for target-rich neighborhoods, tactics for denying body cam footage release under technical failure pretenses, and references to specific citizens as activist liabilities. Naomi Sinclair's name appeared no fewer than 18 times, flagged in a departmental bulletin as high visibility. High risk manage with narrative control. Even more devastating were the files showing that Fairview County had paid out settlements totaling over $1.4 million in civil suits related to officer misconduct in the past 4 years, none of which had ever been made public, thanks to tightly controlled non-disclosure agreements signed under duress. And then there was the Sentinel Agreement, a contract between the county and Sentinel Corrections Corporation, laced with clauses rewarding high occupancy and providing bonuses for monthly inmate intake thresholds. In the encrypted correspondence between the mayor and Sentinel executives, investigators found phrases like maintain flow, district yield lagging, and, most damning of all, ensure Sinclair case does not expand past local jurisdiction. It was no longer just misconduct. It was a conspiracy, a racketeering enterprise that had weaponized the justice system against its own citizens for profit and power. Back at Naomi's house now under federal protection after the threats against her sister and the attack on Isaac. Isaac sat propped on the couch, arm still in a sling, reading the headline from the Washington Post aloud. Feds raid Fairview, conspiracy to violate rights, say prosecutors. Naomi sat across from him, her fingers laced tightly together, eyes glassy but fierce. I said they wouldn't break us, she murmured. Isaac nodded slowly. They broke themselves trying to stop you. Outside, reporters gathered by the dozens. The same camera crews that had once called her delusional now referred to her as the woman who cracked a county wide open. Protesters held signs with her image alongside slogans, "If they'll do this to a Supreme Court justice, what about the rest of us?" But Naomi wasn't thinking about vindication. She was thinking about Jamari Bell, still missing, about the bruises on Isaac's face, about the letters her sister received, about the people in Fairview with no platform, no robes, no title, who had been chewed up by this system in silence for years, and who might never see justice. She stood slowly, steadied herself against the wall, and looked to Isaac. "We've cracked it open," she said. "Now we bury them in truth." The tides had turned, but the reckoning had only just begun. It was a brisk morning in late October when Naomi Sinclair, wrapped in a charcoal gray coat and a scarf the color of blood, stepped onto the courthouse steps and faced the forest of microphones before her. The building behind her loomed tall, an emblem of the law she had served for more than 5 decades, but now she stood not as its arbiter, but as its challenger. "We are not here today just because I was assaulted," she began, her voice calm but fierce. "We are here because hundreds, maybe thousands of people in Fairview have been silenced, brutalized, and erased by a system designed to protect power. Not people. That ends now." With those words, Naomi filed a sweeping federal class-action civil rights lawsuit, Sinclair v. Fairview County, backed by the Southern Justice Legal Alliance, one of the nation's most formidable public interest law groups. Within 48 hours, the suit named more than 40 individual defendants, including Officer Garrett Nash, Chief Randall Croft, Mayor Clayton Redford, and Judge Ellis Drummond, alongside the Fairview County Police Department and Sentinel Corrections Corporation. What began as one woman's stand against humiliation had now evolved into a full-blown legal assault on an entire county's corrupt infrastructure. And Naomi, with her bearing of dignity and a steel spine forged in decades of courtroom battles, became its reluctant but resolute face. The case exploded into the national consciousness. Within 5 days of filing, over 300 people had reached out to the Alliance, recounting eerily similar experiences, routine traffic stops that turned violent, petty citations that ballooned into criminal records, asset seizures that wiped out life savings, and always, the same denominator: black skin, brown skin, low income, no clout. The lead plaintiffs beside Naomi were a grandmother whose wrist had been broken when she asked why her grandson was being arrested, a 22-year-old man wrongfully jailed for 91 days after refusing to consent to a search, and a former high school teacher whose car was seized through asset forfeiture despite no charges ever being filed. The stories varied in detail, but were bound by a singular truth. This was never about justice. It was about control. The trial began the second week of January, inside the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. Snow had dusted the ground that morning, a rare occurrence in Georgia, and the chill in the air seemed to settle inside every corner of the packed courtroom. Naomi sat with her legal team, 6 attorneys from the Southern Justice Legal Alliance, 3 independent civil rights experts, and her old clerk Isaac Monroe, who now walked with a cane but carried fire in his eyes. The defense, bloated with money and arrogance, brought in a legal army, high-profile corporate attorneys for Sentinel, county lawyers trying to play the overwhelmed municipality card, a private firm representing Mayor Redford, paid with funds traced back to the same slush accounts Naomi's team had exposed during the FBI raids. But the courtroom didn't bend to spectacle. It bowed to testimony. For 17 straight days, witness after witness took the stand and painted a portrait of institutional rot so vast, so methodical. It could no longer be written off as rogue behavior. An elderly man recounted being stopped 37 times in 5 years, 37, without a single citation resulting in a conviction. A teenager tearfully described being coerced into pleading guilty to a charge of obstruction after asking why his friend was being searched. And then came the mothers, dozens of them, whose sons were arrested on vague charges, offered plea deals before they understood their rights, and funneled into Sentinel's detention facility to pad occupancy quotas and feed corporate profits. Naomi herself took the stand on day 11. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She wore no makeup, save for the faint trace of the scar just above her right temple, still visible beneath careful lighting. She recounted the stop, the baton, the handcuffs, the station, the laughter, the insult, the blood, the fear. And then she told the jury what she had seen in that holding cell. "Not just me," she said. "Them. The young man with the busted lip, the elderly woman sobbing quietly in the corner, the boy whose only crime was being born black and poor. I sat in judgment of others for decades. That night, I saw who had been judged without ever seeing a courtroom. Her testimony didn't need theatrics. It was truth, distilled, and it pierced like a blade." When closing arguments ended 3 weeks later, the 12-member jury deliberated for just over 10 hours. They returned on a Friday afternoon, the courthouse heavy with silence as the clerk read the verdict. "We find in favor of the plaintiffs, on all counts." The numbers stunned even Naomi. $160 million in total damages, $45 million in compensatory damages to be distributed among class members, and $115 million in punitive damages aimed squarely at the institutions that had allowed this abuse to flourish unchecked. But the money was only part of the reckoning. Judge Elena Moreau, presiding over the case, added a decree of her own, effective immediately. She ruled, Fairview County Police Department will be placed under 5 years of independent federal oversight. The citation quota system is abolished. All civil asset forfeiture policies are suspended, pending legislative review. Sentinel Corrections' contract with the county is voided, and any officer or public official found to have participated in the cover-up shall be referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Naomi closed her eyes, just for a moment, as Isaac reached for her hand. Outside, a crowd had gathered, holding signs not of protest, but of reverence. Some simply read justice for all. Others bore Naomi's silhouette, with one word etched beneath it. Enough. Naomi stepped out of the courthouse that evening, with snow melting under her heels, reporters shouting her name, flashbulbs bursting like fireworks. But her eyes weren't on the cameras. They were on the mothers standing in the back, on the teachers, the workers, the old men with walking sticks, and the teenagers with hard stares. On the forgotten. The law had spoken. But Naomi knew the truth. Justice had only just begun. It was supposed to be over. The verdict had been read. The streets of Fairview had erupted with tears and singing and quiet relief. Cameras had captured Naomi Sinclair walking down the courthouse steps in the winter twilight, flanked by generations who had endured too much, too long. But power never relinquishes itself quietly. Barely 2 weeks after the ruling, on a rainy Thursday morning at exactly 9:17, the Fairview County legal team filed a formal notice of appeal. Their claim: the federal court had overstepped its jurisdiction. The damages were excessive. The class certification was flawed. The reforms too sweeping. Buried beneath legalese and bad faith was a singular message: we may have lost the battle, but we're not giving up the war. Naomi saw the filing not as a surprise, but as a symptom. In her world, corruption never limped away. It doubled down, and this time, it reached for its most dangerous weapon: delay through procedure. The U.S. 11th Circuit Court reviewed the appeal in record time. Civil rights groups from across the country submitted amicus briefs supporting the original ruling. The Department of Justice, still deep in its criminal investigation into Fairview's police and political structure, offered a rare public statement in support of the reforms. Still, the appeals court, citing the national implications, kicked the case up to the highest court in the land. And so it was on a snowy Tuesday in March that the United States Supreme Court agreed to hear the case now known as Redford v. Sinclair. The irony was cruel. Naomi Sinclair had spent her life climbing toward the bench that now loomed above her, not to be seated, but to be judged. Because she was a direct party to the case, she was required to recuse herself. The rules were immutable. For the first time since her appointment, Naomi would not sit in deliberation. She would sit in the gallery, alongside the public, the press, and her enemies, and wait to see whether justice would still wear its blindfold or if it would flinch beneath the weight of power. The courtroom was full before dawn on the day of oral arguments. By 5:27 in the morning, the line outside had already wrapped around First Street. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder with law students, pastors, activists, and mothers who had lost their sons to the very system Naomi had helped expose. Inside, the seats reserved for the public were packed tight. Naomi arrived through the side entrance, escorted by federal marshals who had not left her side since the threats against her family resumed. Isaac Monroe sat beside her, though he still walked with a cane. His eyes were razor-sharp, scanning every movement in the room. Across the aisle, attorneys for Fairview County and Sentinel Corrections looked smug, freshly pressed, and confident that legal technicalities would do what public outrage had failed to accomplish: bury the truth under paperwork. Their argument hinged on familiar terrain: judicial overreach. They insisted the federal court had no right to impose structural reforms on a local police department. They claimed the quota system, while perhaps imperfect, did not rise to the level of constitutional violation. They suggested that the testimonies collected those of bruised elders, silenced teens, and terrified mothers were anecdotal at best. Naomi didn't move as she listened. She had heard these arguments before, just wrapped in cleaner language. This wasn't about the law. It was about shielding the powerful from consequence. But the justices weren't so easily swayed. Justice Farah El-Amin, the court's youngest and fiercest civil libertarian, cut through the noise. If a police department routinely fabricates charges, targets citizens by race, and is incentivized by a private prison contract to increase incarceration, what, then, is the role of the federal courts to observe, to file commentary? Her words echoed like thunder. Justice Robert Klein, a conservative known for his reverence for state autonomy, surprised everyone when he asked if structural reform isn't permissible after documented systemic abuse. What mechanism is left to protect the Constitution? Settlements silence. The court session ran 4 hours, nearly double the scheduled time. When the gavel finally fell, Naomi stood slowly, her legs stiff from stillness but her heart racing. Outside, the cameras waited. Inside, nothing more could be done. The justices would deliberate. She would wait. Those were the longest 41 days of her life. In that time, public opinion only swelled. The New York Times ran an op-ed titled, "If Not Now," when The Atlantic called it the most significant civil rights case since Brown versus Board. Polling showed 71% of Americans believed the reforms should stand. The streets outside the court filled with candlelight vigils, marches, and even prayer circles. Still, Naomi remained quiet. Her time to speak had passed. Now she could only hope that the institution she had given her life to would not betray its purpose. The decision came down on a windswept Monday morning, just past 10 o'clock. She sat in her office, curtains drawn, Isaac beside her, the television volume low. The Supreme Court's spokeswoman stepped before the microphones. The crowd hushed. "In the matter of Redford v. Sinclair," she read, "the court finds, by a vote of 7-1, to uphold the decision of the 11th Circuit and affirm the lower court's ruling." Naomi closed her eyes, including the full award of damages, the mandated federal oversight of the Fairview County Police Department, and the dissolution of the quota and asset forfeiture systems. Isaac let out a slow breath, almost a sob. The opinion, authored by Chief Justice Parker himself, was sweeping. When systemic constitutional violations become embedded within a local institution, the federal judiciary has not only the authority but the duty to remedy them with structural reform. It read, "Courts must not be handcuffed by fear of overreach when faced with patterns of oppression cloaked in procedural normalcy, where the law is weaponized against the vulnerable. Judicial intervention is not activism, it is fidelity to the Constitution." It was more than a ruling. It was a rebuke, and it was precedent. Only Justice Terence Bolton dissented, writing a narrow objection on the scope of remedies, but even he did not dispute the underlying abuses. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She simply stood and looked out the window at the street below, where people were beginning to gather. Some carried signs, others clutched candles, even in daylight. All of them had waited with her. All of them had fought, in their own way. The phone rang. It was the president. "I just watched history happen," he said. "You did it." "No," Naomi replied. "We did it." In the weeks that followed, legal scholars hailed the decision as a jurisprudential earthquake. Law schools added Redford v. Sinclair to their constitutional law syllabi. Civil rights groups across the country used it to reopen long-stalled reform efforts. The Department of Justice launched investigations in 5 other jurisdictions where similar patterns had been alleged. Even Congress, often slow to act, introduced the Sinclair Act legislation aimed at ending federal funding for departments that maintained enforcement quotas or asset-based policing practices without judicial oversight. Naomi returned to the bench. Her recusal lifted, her robe heavier with the burden and blessing of what she had endured. She continued to rule not as an avenger, but as a steward. Her opinions grew sharper, more precise, her dissents cut cleaner. She became a lodestar for a new generation of justices and judges who saw the law not just as a shield, but as a scalpel, something to excise harm, not hide it. And when asked, years later, what the ruling meant to her personally, she would pause, then say softly, "It meant the law still bends, it still breathes, and if you push hard enough, it still moves toward justice." That spring, Naomi returned to Fairview not to testify, not to fight, but to walk its streets. The police department had a new name, a new chief, a civilian review board with teeth. The holding cell where she had once sat was now an empty room with a plaque on the wall. It read simply, "Justice begins with truth." She walked by the park where children now played without fear. She saw murals painted with faces once unseen. And at the end of the day, she stood once more at the courthouse steps where it all began. The wind lifting her gray curls, the crowd parting to let her pass. The Supreme Court had ruled, but long before that, Naomi Sinclair had delivered a verdict of her own that silence was no longer acceptable, that dignity would not be denied, and that even the most entrenched systems of injustice could be shattered so long as someone dared to stand. And she had. It began with a single room, a row of folding chairs, and Naomi Sinclair's unwavering voice echoing through a modest hall in Atlanta. The Sinclair Justice Initiative was not born from wealth or legacy. It was born from pain, from outrage, from the bruises on her wrist that never fully faded, and the dry blood that once crusted on her temple after Officer Nash struck her down. The initiative didn't seek vengeance. It sought power, the kind that came from knowledge, resources, and the law wielded by the people it was meant to serve. Within 6 months, it had offices in 5 states. By the end of its 2nd year, it had represented over 2,000 victims of law enforcement abuse, providing not just legal counsel, but visibility. For too long, the system had banked on silence. Naomi, now hailed as the conscience of American justice, built a movement on the opposite relentless, unapologetic truth. Fairview County itself had transformed into a symbol of what was possible when corruption collapsed and community rose in its place. The old police department was dismantled entirely, its former name stricken from all signage and documents. In its place stood the Fairview Community Public Safety Division, a reimagined institution with civilian oversight, restorative justice officers, and a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling and use-of-force abuse. The department was overseen not by politicians, but by a diverse civilian board with legal authority. Officer training emphasized de-escalation, mental health awareness, and constitutional law. Every badge came with a binding oath not just to enforce the law, but to serve the people with humanity. When departments from across the country came to study Fairview's turnaround, the local sheriff said simply, "We learned from our worst day. Now we work to earn our best." As for those who tried to preserve the old way, justice did not forget them. Officer Garrett Nash, whose smug laughter had once accompanied his baton strike across Naomi's brow, now sat behind federal bars. The trial had lasted 8 days. The evidence, including the recovered body cam footage, was irrefutable. The jury convicted him on all charges: civil rights violations, excessive force, false imprisonment, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 14 years without parole. During sentencing, the judge noted, "You didn't just strike a woman that day, you struck the very idea of law as a shield, not a weapon." Chief Randall Croft, the man who had orchestrated the quotas, ordered the suppression of evidence, and turned a blind eye to years of misconduct, faced even graver consequences. Federal prosecutors indicted him on conspiracy, racketeering, and destruction of evidence. Testimonies from officers like Daniela Ruiz and recovered department emails revealed a vast, deliberate system of targeting, abusing, and covering up. Croft's trial gripped the nation. His defense that he was maintaining order was shredded by prosecutors who showed that what he'd truly maintained was a fiefdom of fear. He was convicted and sentenced to 21 years in federal prison. Mayor Clayton Redford didn't fare much better. The man who had smiled on every billboard in town, who had taken campaign donations from Sentinel Corrections, while black mothers buried their sons, he too was indicted. Wire fraud, abuse of office, conspiracy to violate civil rights. His secret involvement in the quota system was exposed through encrypted texts and bank records. His trial ended with a 10-year sentence and the total collapse of his political dynasty. In the final moments of his conviction, Naomi watched from the gallery. She didn't feel triumph, only resolution. No one, no matter how high their office, would be allowed to exploit the people in the shadows ever again. Years passed, and still, Naomi worked. Though she remained on the Supreme Court bench, she often declined speaking engagements and accolades. She believed in legacy through action, not ceremony, But one invitation, delivered by hand in a pale blue envelope, caused her to pause. It was from the new Fairview Community Council. They were hosting a town celebration marking the 5-year anniversary of the Sinclair reforms. They wanted her to come home. She returned quietly, arriving just after sunrise in the same neighborhood where it had all begun, Elmhurst and Carter Avenue, the corner where she had once been pulled over, cuffed, and brutalized now bore a bronze marker embedded in the sidewalk. It read, "On this spot." Justice was interrupted but not denied, because one woman refused to be silent. Across the street, a mural stretched 2 stories high. Naomi's face, regal and unflinching, watched over the block like a guardian. But it wasn't vanity that moved her. It was the children playing beneath it, skateboarding and laughing and riding scooters, unafraid. She took a slow walk through the neighborhood. The air smelled of magnolias. The homes were familiar, but brighter somehow. And then she saw it, an officer stepping out of his cruiser to approach a black woman who'd parked awkwardly in front of a hydrant. Naomi watched, heart tight in her chest, but the officer smiled, gestured politely, and helped the woman move her car. No shouting, no hand on a holster, no accusation, just decency, basic human respect. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes before she realized it. It had taken too many years, too many lives, and too much pain. But here, on this the street, in the town that once tried to silence her, something had changed. Not everything, but enough to begin again. Later that evening, as the community gathered for speeches and music and food trucks lined the block, Naomi took the stage briefly. She stood without notes, without preamble. "I came back not because I wanted to be honored," she said. "I came back to see if the dream was still alive, and I saw it today in a small act, on a small street, between 2 strangers. That is what justice looks like when it breathes, not in courtrooms or verdicts alone, but in everyday kindness, restored dignity, and the absence of fear." The crowd stood in silence, then erupted in applause. As night fell and the crowd began to disperse, a young girl approached Naomi. She wore a tiny badge-shaped necklace and held a notebook in her hand. "I want to be a lawyer," she said shyly. Naomi bent down, smiled, and signed her name on the first page. "Then promise me," she whispered, "you'll always ask the hard questions and never, ever forget who the law is supposed to serve." The girl nodded, her eyes bright with possibility. Naomi Sinclair walked into the warm night, her heart full. She had not set out to become a symbol. She had only wanted to be treated with respect. But in standing up, she had done more than reclaim her dignity. She had ignited a movement. The Sinclair Justice Initiative would grow to serve thousands more. The reforms in Fairview would inspire legislation in 20 states. Courtrooms would cite Redford versus Sinclair for decades to come. But on that night, in the quiet, after the music ended, Naomi sat on a bench beneath the mural and simply breathed. She had lived long enough to see the law remember what it was meant to be. And that, above all, was justice. The morning was quiet, hushed in the way only cemeteries can be, the kind of stillness that draws reverence from the earth itself. Naomi Sinclair stood beneath a gray sky on the gently sloping hill of Oakview Memorial Gardens, where rows of stone markers rose like the chorus of a long-forgotten hymn. She was wrapped in a long black coat, a silk scarf at her throat, and a single bouquet of white lilies cradled in her hands. The wind whispered through the tall cypress trees, as if remembering something sacred. It had been 10 years since she buried him, Jonathan Sinclair, her partner, her witness, her compass when the world lost its bearings. And now, after all this time, she had something more than grief to bring him. She stepped softly through the grass, her heels sinking slightly in the soft spring soil, and stopped before the simple granite stone etched with his name, his rank, and the words, "Beloved husband, eternal teacher." She knelt slowly, her knees creaking not from age alone, but from the weight of what had passed between then and now. She placed the lilies gently at the base of the stone. Her fingers lingered there, tracing his name like a prayer. Then she exhaled. "We did it, John," she whispered, her voice as steady as it was soft. "We changed the law, but more importantly, we changed the system." Her words did not echo, but the silence that followed was filled with something deep and eternal. Memory, love, purpose. She let her hand rest on the stone for a moment longer, then sat back on her heels, her eyes gazing into the distance where the hills rolled gently beyond the town they once called home. She remembered how, so many years ago, she had sat in this same cemetery after one of the darkest days of her life, blood drying on her temple, wrists bruised from handcuffs, her dignity nearly shattered. And she remembered thinking then, if this can happen to me, what hope does anyone else have? But now, she knew the answer. Hope didn't rest on titles. It wasn't sealed in courtrooms or signed into law by governors or presidents. Hope was the force that rose up when a woman, any woman, said no more. It was every whistleblower, every clerk, every injured citizen who stepped forward to testify. It was Isaac, limping from an attack but still filing motions at midnight. It was Officer Ruiz, shaking as she hit send on that audio recording. It was the young girl in Fairview with the notebook and the fire in her eyes. That was hope. And it had changed everything. The Sinclair Justice Initiative now had offices in 21 states. Over 12,000 cases had been reviewed, with wrongful convictions overturned and abusive officers finally held accountable. A new federal law, the Sinclair Civil Rights Enforcement Act, mandated transparent data reporting from law enforcement agencies nationwide. Departments were required to disclose use-of-force incidents, demographic disparities, and asset forfeiture records. The Fairview model had spread, with community oversight boards now functioning in over 60 counties, and Sinclair versus Fairview County. The case that started it all was now a mandatory case study at every accredited law school in the United States. Professors taught it not just as precedent, but as a parable. They walked their students through the facts. An elderly black woman, pulled over for no reason, struck and humiliated by a man in uniform. The system that tried to silence her. The retaliations, the attempts to erase the truth. And then they taught what came next, how she built the case not around herself, but around everyone like her. How she refused to settle. How she pursued structural reform, not symbolic gestures. How the law, long used as a blade, was reshaped into a shield. In lecture halls from Boston to Berkeley, students debated qualified immunity, structural injunctions, and the role of courts in dismantling systemic abuse. But they also wrestled with the harder human questions. What does justice look like when it's real? How much does it cost to change a country's conscience, and would they have done what Naomi Sinclair did? Knowing the price, Naomi rose slowly to her feet, brushing a leaf from her coat. A light rain had started to fall, a soft mist that kissed the grass rather than drowned it. She pulled her scarf a little tighter and looked once more at the grave. "You always believed in me," she said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Even when I didn't believe in myself, especially then. Then she turned toward the car waiting on the path behind her nothing official. Just Isaac in the driver's seat, as he'd always insisted. He had gray in his beard now, and he still carried a cane, but he also carried the quiet, defiant pride of a man who had walked through fire and come out whole. He nodded as she approached, opening the passenger door without a word. She slid in and closed the door. The engine purred to life. "Back to D.C., he asked gently. "Back to work," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "There's still more to do." As they pulled away, Naomi glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The headstone grew smaller with each turn of the wheel. But the truth it marked, the promise it held, remained larger than ever. She had not just changed one policy or one police department. She had changed the soul of a system. She had reminded a nation that justice must be fought for, lived for, and sometimes suffered for. That it isn't handed down from on high, it rises up from the places where people refuse to be broken. And as long as there were those people, those everyday warriors, students, mothers, sons, whistleblowers, and freedom dreamers, then the fight would never truly be lost. In time, the textbooks would say her name like they said Thurgood or Ginsburg. Naomi Sinclair, Justice Sinclair, the woman who took on the law and bent it toward humanity. But for now, she was just Naomi, a widow, a warrior, a witness. And somewhere in the quiet hush of the earth, the man she loved was smiling back at her, not because she won, but because she never gave up. Not for one day, not for one breath, not ever. If there's one truth that echoes through the story of Justice Naomi Sinclair, it's this: silence is complicity. And courage, no matter how quiet, can shift the soul of a nation. Naomi was 75 years old when she was pulled from her car, struck across the temple, and cuffed like a criminal in the very city she once called home. She had broken no laws, wielded no threats. Her only offense was existing, visibly, black and elderly, in a system that too often treats dignity like a luxury and rights like a privilege to be earned. But what happened next wasn't just about Naomi, it was about all of us, about what we tolerate, about what we excuse, about how many names we forget, until the list is so long. It wraps around our conscience like a chain. What Naomi's story demands from every American is not pity, but participation. We must stop treating injustice as news, as headlines, as hashtags. We must start seeing it for what it is: a daily referendum on our values, our laws, and our willingness to stand up when standing is hard. Naomi could have taken the payout. She could have gone home. She could have let the department issue a quiet apology, wipe her blood from the pavement, and move on like nothing happened. But she didn't. She chose to fight not just for herself, but for the elderly man beaten in silence, for the young woman whose footage was erased, for the black mother whose son was locked up on a lie and buried under quotas and falsified charges. She built her case piece by piece, not with vengeance, but with truth. And in doing so, she dismantled a system that had brutalized her people for decades. We as citizens must ask how many Naomis are out there, unknown, unprotected, unheard. How many small towns are hiding big sins behind blue walls and court seals? How many communities are quietly bleeding while we scroll past, look away, and say, "It's complicated." But justice is not complicated. It's clear. It's direct. It is the unyielding belief that the law belongs to us all, or it belongs to no one. Naomi reminded us that the law is only as good as those who are brave enough to enforce it with integrity and to challenge it when it fails. That challenge starts with you, with your vote, with your voice, with your vigilance. You don't need a robe or a bench to defend what's right. You just need to care more than they count on you to. Speak up at city halls. Demand transparency from your local police. Ask your prosecutors where they stand on reform. Support the journalists and whistleblowers who risk everything to tell the truth. And when you see a video or hear a story like Naomi's, don't just be shocked. Be moved to act. Share it. Talk about it. Let it change you. Because silence, in the face of oppression, is a verdict all its own. Naomi's fight became a law school case study, not because she was extraordinary, but because she refused to be treated as ordinary when injustice demanded submission. Her courage became curriculum, her testimony became precedent, and her refusal to settle became a blueprint for how to shake the pillars of power until something righteous falls into place. The Sinclair Justice Initiative now stretches across more than 20 states, and yet even with its reach, it cannot succeed without you. Reform is not a spectator sport. It's not a documentary to be watched. It's a door to be kicked open, again and again, by people like you, ordinary citizens with extraordinary determination. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think, made you angry, made you hopeful, then let it do more than sit in your memory. Let it move your fingers, like this video. Share it. Send it to someone who thinks the system can't change. Subscribe to this channel and stay part of this conversation. Because the stories you hear here aren't fiction, they are warnings. They are blueprints. They are battle cries disguised as bedtime stories for the soul of this country. Justice isn't abstract. It's what happens when a frightened young officer chooses to do the right thing instead of following a corrupt order. It's what happens when a Supreme Court, faced with immense pressure, chooses principle over politics and affirms a nation's duty to right systemic wrongs. And it's what happens when a 75-year-old woman, bloodied and bruised, stands before the highest court in the land not as a judge, but as a witness to what the law must become. Naomi's story may end with reforms and court rulings, but its power begins when you decide what you'll do next. Will you remember her name? Will you protect your neighbor? Will you challenge your leaders? Or will you turn away? Tell yourself it's not your fight, and let the next injustice fester in the shadows. The choice is yours, and it has always been yours, because real justice doesn't come from institutions. It comes from people who are unwilling to accept anything less. So if you believe in that kind of justice, deep, messy, painful, necessary, then be part of it. Subscribe. Stay engaged. Learn the law. Know your rights. And make your voice too loud to ignore. Hit that like button, not for clicks, but for clarity. Share this story with someone who still believes the system can't be touched. Because Naomi Sinclair touched it. And she didn't just change the verdict, she changed the game. So ask yourself if she could fight through threats, pain, humiliation, and power trying to crush her. What's stopping you from hitting shared justice demands witnesses. Be one. Justice demands action. Take it. And justice demands memory. So let's never forget Naomi Sinclair. Not because she was broken, but because she refused to be. Let her story be your starting line. The movement is here. The question is, will you stand with it?